Imagine coming home in the middle of the night, the thrill of your secret affair still buzzing in your veins, only to find your suitcase packed by the door, your husband waiting in the dim glow of the TV, and undeniable proof of your betrayal playing on the screen. No screaming, no second chances, just a thick envelope filled with divorce papers, and the shattered look in your daughter's eyes. This is the moment Olivia Parker's life fell apart. But what happens next? Well, that's where things get interesting. The night air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt as Olivia Parker stepped out of the cab, her heels clicking against the pavement in an erratic rhythm. The city was quiet at this hour, the usual hum of traffic replaced by the distant sound of a passing train. She adjusted her coat, tugging it tighter around her frame, as if that could shield her from the storm brewing inside her chest. It had been a reckless decision, meeting Nathan tonight. A decision she'd made too many times before, each time convincing herself that she had control over the situation. But as she reached the front steps of her suburban house, the thrill of the evening drained away, replaced by something colder. The house was illuminated, every window aglow, casting a stark contrast against the deep black of the night. That wasn't normal. At this hour, the place should have been dark, her husband already asleep, their daughter curled up in bed. Her pulse quickened. She hesitated at the door, her fingers hovering over the handle. Years of working in journalism had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every fiber of her being screamed that something was wrong. Taking a breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with a tension that wrapped around her throat like a noose. And then she saw it. Her suitcase. The expensive luggage set that Dylan had given her for their anniversary last year. Neatly packed. Sitting by the door like an unwelcome guest. Her stomach twisted. She stepped further inside, the wooden floors creaking beneath her unsteady steps. The living room was dimly lit, the glow of the television casting eerie shadows along the walls. And there, sitting on the couch, was Dylan, her husband of 16 years. He didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, his jaw tight, his fingers curled around the armrest in a way that made her stomach drop. And then she saw it. The footage. High-definition clips playing in brutal, undeniable clarity. Her and Nathan, together, their secret meetings captured from multiple angles. A montage of betrayal playing on repeat. The blood in her veins turned to ice. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat had closed up. Her body felt disconnected from her mind. Her thoughts a chaotic mess of shock and panic. Without a word, Dylan reached beside him and picked up a thick envelope, holding it out to her. Her fingers trembled as she took it. The weight of the papers inside told her what it was before she even opened it. Divorce papers. A part of her had always known this day might come, but the finality of it still sent a wave of nausea through her. And then movement caught her eye. From the dimly lit hallway, their daughter, Ava, stepped forward. 16. Too young to carry this kind of pain. Her eyes were swollen, her expression raw with betrayal. In her hands, she clutched one of Dylan's sculptures, a piece he had made months ago. A glass heart, now fractured down the middle. The symbolism wasn't lost on Olivia. When Ava finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, heavy with emotion. How could you? That was it. Just those two words. But they landed harder than any screaming match, any accusation. Olivia reached out, desperate to touch her daughter, to offer some kind of explanation. But Ava flinched, stepping back, clutching the broken sculpture like it was the last fragile thing she had left. The rejection stung worse than anything Olivia had ever felt. Dylan finally turned to her, his voice controlled, but cold enough to cut through the air like a knife. We know everything. That was all he said. Nothing more, nothing less. There was no shouting.
No dramatic confrontation.
Just a quiet, inescapable truth settling over the room like a death sentence. And with that, her world collapsed. The neon motel sign buzzed faintly, its flickering light casting eerie shadows on the damp pavement. Olivia Parker sat motionless on the edge of the stiff mattress, her perfectly polished nails digging into the cheap fabric of the bedspread. The room smelled of old tobacco and artificial lemon cleaner, a stark contrast to the familiar scent of lavender candles that used to fill her home. Her phone rested beside her, its screen glowing with unanswered calls. She had tried dialing Nathan's number more times than she could count, but every attempt ended the same, straight to voicemail. Each time, the desperation in her messages grew, her words becoming fragmented pleas for reassurance, for something, anything, that might anchor her in the middle of the storm. But the silence stretched, unbroken. She glanced at the expensive suitcase near the door. It looked absurd in a place like this, a relic from a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. The weight of reality pressed down on her chest. Just hours ago, she had walked into her home expecting nothing more than another night of secrecy and careful lies. Now she was here, banished, discarded, reduced to nothing more than the consequence of her own choices. Morning came too quickly. The motel walls were thin, every passing car and distant siren slicing through her restless sleep. She forced herself to get up, smoothing out her clothes, brushing away the traces of the previous night. The mirror above the sink reflected someone she barely recognized. Her usually flawless appearance now a mess of tired eyes and smudged makeup. At the newsroom, the shift in atmosphere was instant. Conversations halted the moment she walked in, replaced by stolen glances and quiet murmurs that followed her every step. She moved through the hallway with practiced confidence, her heels clicking against the floor, head held high. But beneath the surface, her stomach twisted at the weight of their judgment. Her name had always commanded respect here. Now it was spoken in hushed voices, her scandal the latest source of entertainment. The station manager wasted no time calling her into the office. Seated across the desk, Olivia listened to the thinly veiled warning. Viewers demanded trust in their news anchors, and trust was fragile. The station wasn't ready to cut her loose, yet, but her position was no longer secure. The slightest misstep, the smallest controversy, and she'd be gone. She offered ideas, reaching for anything that might shift the conversation, but each suggestion was met with thinly concealed skepticism. The reality was clear. This wasn't something she could talk her way out of. Before she had time to process what came next, Nathan appeared. His usual charm was absent, replaced by something sharp, panicked. He pulled her aside, his voice low, his tone urgent. The scandal had reached his wife, and the fallout was spreading. His career was on the line, his options dwindling. And then, the final blow. He was leaving. Another station, a fresh start. One that didn't include her. The decision had already been made. His concern for her drowned beneath the urgency of his own survival. Olivia didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. Hours later, as the evening settled in, she found herself driving through familiar streets, drawn back to the house that was no longer hers. The warm glow of the living room lights spilled onto the porch, casting soft silhouettes against the curtains. Through the window, she saw them, Dylan and Ava, seated together, close. The air between them was heavy, but not broken. The space Olivia had once occupied had already reshaped itself in her absence. Then something new. Boxes stacked near the hallway. Not just divorce. A full departure. Her breath hitched as the realization set in. He wasn't just moving on. He was erasing her presence completely. The panic clawed at her throat as she reached for her phone, dialing his number. But the call disconnected before it could ring. She tried again, and again. Each attempt met the same result. He had severed every line of contact. The finality of it settled in, heavier than anything she had prepared herself for. The motel room felt smaller when she returned. The walls pressed in closer, the weight of isolation sinking deeper. She had spent so long believing she could control the narrative, bend the world to her will with the right words and the right timing. But this wasn't a headline she could rewrite. This time, there was no undoing the damage. She had lost everything. The morning air carried the scent of damp leaves and fresh earth as Dylan Parker stepped into his backyard studio. It was early, the world still quiet except for the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. The space was his sanctuary, the one place where the noise of his mind dulled into something manageable. He moved toward his workbench, his gaze falling on the shards of glass scattered across its surface. Last night's frustration had spilled into his work, transforming what was meant to be a sculpture into a pile of fractured pieces. Yet, as he ran his fingers over the edges, he saw potential in the wreckage. That was all life had been lately, picking up the remains of what once was and trying to shape something new. Ava barely spoke these days. She had always been vibrant, full of laughter and energy, the kind of presence that lit up a room without even trying. But now, she drifted through the house like a ghost, shoulders hunched, eyes vacant. He saw the way she avoided certain spots, like the chair at the dinner table that used to belong to her mother. The way she turned off the news whenever Olivia's face appeared on the screen. At school, things were worse. Dylan had hoped that the scandal would fade from public interest quickly, but the reality was crueler. People fed off drama, and this one had all the elements of a perfect storm. Whispers trailed behind Ava in the hallways, a never-ending reminder of what had been taken from her. Conversations hushed when she walked past, eyes flickering toward her before darting away. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. She was guilty by association. And then there was Amber, once her best friend, now her biggest tormentor. It started subtly, snide remarks, quiet enough to be ignored. But silence only emboldened cruelty. The words became sharper, the digs more deliberate. Guess lying runs in the family, Amber had mused one afternoon, her voice casual but laced with malice. Ava had clenched her fists but kept walking. The next day it was worse. Didn't your mom run off with some guy? Maybe you'll do the same someday. That was the moment something inside her snapped. Ava barely remembered lunging forward, only the rush of movement and the sharp burst of adrenaline. The scuffle was messy. Books hitting the floor, frantic yells, the sharp pull of hands separating them before she could do any real damage. The principal's office smelled of old coffee and worn leather. She sat rigid in her chair, staring at the desk, refusing to meet Dylan's gaze. He had arrived within minutes of the call, his expression unreadable as the school counselor explained the situation. Slipping grades, isolation, concerning behavior. Dylan absorbed the words, but his focus remained on Ava, on the way her hands curled into fists in her lap, on the dark circles beneath her eyes, on the exhaustion that stretched beyond physical fatigue. The car ride home was silent. That night, Dylan didn't ask her to talk. Instead, he led her to his workbench. The space was unfamiliar to her, a place she had rarely entered before. The sharp scent of glass polish lingered in the air, the workbench cluttered with half-finished pieces, tools, fragments waiting to be made whole again. Without a word, he handed her a piece of unfinished glass. Ava hesitated, then reached for it. The first few minutes passed without a sound, but something about the simplicity of movement, the quiet focus of shaping the edges, steadied her. The sharpness of her thoughts dulled, giving way to something else. As the hours stretched on, she spoke. Not about school, not about her mother, but about the glass, about the way light refracted through the cracks, about how something broken could still catch the light in ways that made it beautiful. Dylan listened, not just to the words, but to the space between them. By the time the piece was finished, the tension in the air had shifted. It wasn't a solution, it wasn't a fix, but it was a beginning. Across town, Olivia sat alone in the dimly lit newsroom, the walls closing in around her. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken judgment. Conversations had changed since the scandal broke. Not in volume, but in tone. People no longer gossiped when she entered the room. Instead, they grew silent, their glances sharp with unspoken thoughts. She had been the face of credibility, the trusted anchor who delivered hard-hitting news with confidence. Now, she was nothing more than a cautionary tale. Her desk, once a place of command, now felt like a cage. Every email, every message, was a reminder that she was no longer at the top. The station hadn't fired her yet, but her presence was no longer welcomed. She had spent years mastering public perception, controlling narratives, shaping how people saw her. But no matter how carefully she spun this, the damage had already been done. She scrolled through the news feeds, watching how her downfall was dissected in real time. The scandal had become entertainment, her name trending for all the wrong reasons. She needed to find a way back. Losing the job would mean losing everything. There was no family left to turn to, no safety net. Survival meant adaptation. And if she couldn't control the narrative anymore, she would find another way to stay in the story. The newsroom's artificial glow buzzed overhead as Olivia sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The once familiar space now felt foreign, hostile even. The murmurs had grown quieter in recent days, not because people had moved on, but because they had nothing left to say to her. She was a liability. Carol Blackwell, the station manager, had made that much clear. Her presence was tolerated, but only barely. The anchor chair she once occupied with effortless confidence was now filled by someone else, and the more she lingered, the more inevitable her final dismissal became. Olivia wasn't naive. She had spent years watching careers rise and fall, understanding that power in this industry was fragile. Redemption wasn't handed out, it was taken, and so she made a choice. She pitched the idea of a new series, Rebuilding Trust, a raw, intimate look at families torn apart by betrayal, addiction, or lies. It wasn't about journalism. It was about survival. A way to make people see her as something more than a scandal. Carol listened, but her expression remained unreadable. The silence stretched. Then finally she spoke. "We'll try it. But you won't be doing this alone. Vince Talbot is producing it." Olivia tensed. Talbot was ruthless. His stories cut deep, exposing every weakness in the people he covered. If he smelled blood, he wouldn't hesitate to turn on her. But she nodded, swallowing any protest. This was her only chance. Across town, Dylan Parker stood in his studio, his hands covered in fine cuts from working with glass all day. The latest sculpture in front of him was unlike anything he'd created before. A jagged piece, fractured yet whole, its edges catching the light in an almost ethereal way. People had started noticing his work. His email inbox was full of inquiries, gallery invitations, and, most surprising of all, a message from Olivia Chun, a prestigious curator in New York. She wanted to feature his latest collection in an exhibition titled Emotional Landscapes. The opportunity was massive, career-defining. But Dylan hesitated. Art had always been personal to him, a way to express things he couldn't put into words. Now, his pain had turned into something marketable, something people wanted to consume. And he wasn't sure how he felt about that. Ava interrupted his thoughts, her presence quiet but grounding. She had started spending more time in the studio, sketching in a notebook, experimenting with small glasswork pieces of her own. He watched as she carefully held up a tiny fragment of blue glass, turning it over in her fingers. "I want to create something too," she said, more to herself than to him. Dylan nodded, feeling an unexpected warmth settle in his chest. "Then let's do it." At school, Ava's battles continued. The stares hadn't stopped. The whispers hadn't faded. But she had learned to push through. Photography had become her escape, her way of reclaiming control. She carried her camera everywhere, capturing fleeting moments, shadows stretching across cracked pavement, the way light fractured through shattered glass. She had started sharing her work online, and to her surprise, people responded. A message landed in her inbox from the director of the local youth arts center. They wanted to display her photos in an upcoming student exhibition. She hesitated. Putting herself out there meant opening herself up to more scrutiny, more judgment. But then she remembered the way Dylan worked in his studio, pouring his emotions into something tangible. And so she said yes. Olivia's series launched to lukewarm reception. Viewers weren't sure if they trusted her yet, weren't sure if this was a genuine attempt at redemption or just another performance. Vince Talbot didn't make it easier. Every segment he pushed felt invasive, pressing people to spill their rawest emotions on camera. Olivia knew he was waiting for her to break, to turn the lens back on her. And eventually, she let him. The camera rolled as she spoke about regret, about choices that couldn't be undone. Her voice wavered, her carefully constructed mask slipping. She hadn't meant to cry, but the tears came anyway. Within hours of the segment airing, Clips spread across social media. Some people sympathized. Others tore her apart. Nathan didn't reach out. Dylan didn't acknowledge it. Ava didn't even watch. The silence was worse than the backlash. Olivia had thought this would be the moment things changed. But in the end, all it did was confirm what she had been refusing to accept. Some things couldn't be fixed. Some people had already moved on, and she wasn't one of them. The buzz of anticipation filled the Ellison Gallery in New York as patrons and critics moved through the space, pausing before each sculpture, their hushed voices blending into a low murmur. Dylan Parker stood near the entrance, his hands clasped behind his back, exuding a quiet confidence that hadn't always been there. The exhibit, titled Shattered Reflections, was a culmination of months of work. Pieces of glass carefully broken, rearranged, and fused back together into something new. Every sculpture told a story of pain, resilience, and transformation. It wasn't just his work on display. Ava's photographs lined the opposite wall, each image capturing moments of fracture and light, sunbeams streaming through shattered windows, reflections bouncing off city puddles. The way broken things could still be beautiful. She stood beside him, her fingers gripping the event program, her name printed beneath featured artist. He glanced at her, sensing the nerves rolling beneath her otherwise composed exterior. "You did good," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She let out a slow breath. "Yeah, we both did." For the first time in a long time, things felt right. Across town, Olivia sat in a corner booth of a dimly lit cafe, her disguise barely enough to shield her from recognition. The chatter of conversations buzzed around her, but her focus remained on the phone screen in front of her. The articles were everywhere, from betrayal to brilliance. How Dylan Parker transformed pain into art. Ava Parker's photography stuns at Ellison Gallery exhibit. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her story had become his story. She had spent months trying to repair her image, clawing at relevance, only to watch as the world moved on without her. The last shred of control she had tried to hold onto was slipping through her fingers. And then one final blow, an email from her network. Her contract wouldn't be renewed. She stared at the words until the screen blurred. There would be no redemption arc, no triumphant return. She had become a footnote in someone else's success story. She shut off her phone, the weight of finality pressing down. For the first time, she had nothing left to chase, nothing left to lose. Back at the gallery, the evening wound down, the last guests trickling out into the city streets. Dylan and Ava stood in front of the final sculpture, a collaborative piece they had created together. A jagged, fractured structure, fused with streaks of gold and deep blue. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding something new within it. Ava traced her fingers along the edges, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did this." Dylan nodded. They had survived the storm, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something waiting to be built.